We are in our series, Future Church, and this is week 4. This is the conclusion. And the reason why we've done this entire series is because leaving organized religion in America is trending. For the first time ever, the latest research shows that the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, are the largest religiously affiliated group. Right? They're not affiliated. And when you look at even just church attendance and engagement and involvement, it is just declining. And people are untrustworthy or untrusting of organized religion, and they're leaving. So when we talk about the church, I want to like focus in on kind of what we're talking about and get us all on the same page, because I can't speak for all organized religions, and I certainly am not trying to dissect every aspect of people leaving that, but I kind of want to define and look at kind of what we are talking about. So we said that when people gather on purpose, with purpose, they tend to organize around purpose. And when Jesus said that he was going to start this thing called a church, we have the English word church, which comes from a German word, which meant a building, but Jesus wasn't talking about that. Jesus used the word ecclesia that they would have understood in their language, in their context, to just be a gathering, an assembly of called out citizens. And Jesus said, I'm going to have an assembly of called out citizens in my name. And so that's where you get like the Christian church. And maybe if you look at it, you're like, there's all kinds of things that fall under that banner. Catholic churches and Protestant churches, evangelical, and everything in between that fall under that. And so when we talk about a church, we're simply talking about when people organize around maybe a religious figure or a religious tradition of some sort. And then certainly what Jesus was talking about and what we want to be is that assembly and that gathering in the name of Jesus. And he used a word that they would have understood, and it had nothing to do with a building or an event. It had to do with a gathering group of people. And so we asked this question: how do you carry an ancient movement with an ancient message into a modern future? Can you? That's what we've been discussing. Is it even possible to do that? Or is this trend just going to keep going and organized religion and maybe even the church in Jesus' name just continue to lose relevance and influence in culture? And if we want to get those things back, how do we do that? And so that's what we've been talking about. And characteristic number 1, we said of a future church, they embody irresistible. And what we meant by this is simply this: that it's a church, it's a gathering of people who just love each other, forgive each other, serve each other. We said they each other all the time. It's just one of the things about the earliest church when it first started is they had this incredible generosity to each other. And we find that the letters that the leaders of these churches would write to the churches and the messages they would preach, they would always include some kind of each other, like agree with each other, forgive each other, submit to each other, restore each other, carry each other's burdens. And this made this small group of oppressed and persecuted people, it actually boomed and became, in 300 years, the preferred religion of the Roman Empire that had once persecuted them. And how did they do that? Was because people would look into this group and they would see how they each other, and they wanted to be a part of it. And so we said that to carry that in the future, to look forward, we actually have to kind of look back to that church and look like that church here in our own gathering. And number 2, we said it encourages engagement. A future church is going to encourage engagement, and this isn't just here. I believe that at churches we have to engage people in meaningful conversations, but also we have to engage ourselves in the public square. We got to be so fully integrated into our community that it's just natural that when people talk about what's going on, and specifically in our context in downtown Las Vegas, downtown faith is just a natural part of that because the people are so integrated into the community. And we talked about at the table some ways that we could do that. And then last week we said that they experience mystery. And I'm not even going to try and summarize. I encourage you to go back to last week's message. Really, any of these talks are online on our YouTube page. You can subscribe, and if you miss one, you can always catch up with that. But last week, we went really deep into what we mean by this word mystery that the writers use throughout the New Testament. And so this week, we're moving into number 4, is characteristic of a future church that embraces science. You're like, wait. Isn't there a tension between the science community and the faith community? Right? And maybe for centuries, organized religion and the science community have been seemingly at odds with each other. Right? A lot of times people feel like they have to pick one or the other. Right? I think this tension is unnecessary and it is not warranted. But what happened when we saw this uptick in the trend of people leaving organized religion, what we saw was they inadvertently, maybe even unknowingly, tended to drift towards something else. And a lot of people course correct when you do that, like you leave one thing because maybe you're angry or it doesn't work for you anymore, and you're, I'm going to go way over here, and then you end up kind of course correcting. But something happened, and we around the same time as this trend, we're going to talk about it, and people started leaving organized religion, being less engaged and involved, and they moved towards something. It is often referred to as new atheism. And because of its rationale and its scientific basis, people are like, listen, I can trust this because it's clear, it's evidence-based, it's not irrational, and even the people who still maybe believe in some kind of higher power moved away from organized religion because of all the things maybe negative that they associated with it, and they moved to this other thing considered new atheism. And some people you find are kind of course-correcting a little bit where I'm not necessarily atheist, and they land in this place of agnosticism, which I think is actually a wonderful place to be, because either side of agnosticism is faith at some level, because ultimately we all don't know, right? There is a necessary uncertainty in faith. But there's a few writers that came out around this event that happened in the early 2000s where we started seeing this uptick of people leaving organized religion. One of them is Richard Dawkins, and he says this in his book, The God Delusion: many of us saw religion as harmless nonsense. Beliefs might lack all supporting evidence, but we thought if people needed a crutch for consolation, where's the harm? September 11th changed all that. Right? People saw harm in religion. And then if you look back at most any and every religion or faith tradition, you will find gross atrocities. You'll find this theme of love, and then if you look back, you will see very unloving people doing unloving things to other people in the name of their God, in the name of their religion. And so people started seeing books like this, and then also Christopher Hitchens in the book God Is Not Great: violent, irrational, intolerant, allied to racism and tribalism and bigotry, invested in ignorance and hostile to free inquiry, contemptuous of women and coercive towards children. Organized religion ought to have a great deal on its conscience. People started to wake up. These guys started saying, listen, we've got to share our thoughts now on why religion is dangerous. And then you have Sam Harris, who wrote the book Letters to a Christian Nation. He said it is taboo in our society to criticize a person's religious faith. These taboos are offensive, deeply unreasonable, but worse than that, they are getting people killed. This is really my concern. My concern is that our religions, the diversity of our religious doctrines, is going to get us killed. I'm worried that our religious discourse, our religious beliefs are ultimately incompatible with civilization. You see, these men began to articulate what people were feeling, and that is this: religion, not only is it not the answer to our problems, it actually might itself be the problem. And people who were being hurt by religious traditions, people who the beliefs and the way the beliefs were held, they no longer worked for them. They started to move away from this, and then these guys come on the scenes with their writings, and it makes sense, and they go, yeah, that's what I've experienced. And so people moved and shifted away, and one of the shifts too, and one of the tensions that I think arose to the surface was this tension between faith and science. And that somehow science and technology was opposed to faith, and faith was opposed to scientific discovery and technology. I think, again, and I quote this guy often in one of my favorite books of all time, The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer. He was so ahead of his time. I think what he says here is more relevant now than it was when he wrote it in the early 1900s. He says, the modern scientist has lost God amid the wonders of his world, and we Christians are in real danger of losing God amid the wonders of his word. Right? The way that people were holding their Bibles and the way that people were holding their science, like it ended up putting them at odds with each other, and unnecessarily. This is unnecessary. And so what I want to kind of talk about today is this: embracing science and faith as valid pursuits of knowing and unknowing, discovery and devotion is integral to the future of a church in a modern society, in a modern context. It moves us past dualistic thinking, either or, right? I can trust this community or I can trust this. No. It moves us into an integrated way of thinking and viewing the world. We can accept scientific data and discovery without accepting every agenda or manipulation or use of control around that we may disagree with. Because isn't that what happens? Is we look at evidence and then we automatically disagree with it because maybe that the other, some group over there, is using that to tell us that we're wrong. And vice versa. I don't think there needs to be the tension that there is. I think there's another way forward for people. And so that's what I want to kind of talk about this. Embracing science and faith produces first knowledge and with wisdom. Knowledge with wisdom. A lot of the faith traditions, a lot of what we get, and it's funny, one of the most used names in the Bible is Sophia, or wisdom, used to describe God. Right? And in faith and in faith traditions, and I would say certainly in a faith that follows Jesus, what we find is wisdom. But we need knowledge with wisdom. I think the educational system has to radically reform around this because we have information at our fingertips, all the information of the world at our fingertips, but we have very little wisdom to discern that information. And I think if you embrace science and faith together and you integrate them in your life and in your thinking, what you get is knowledge with wisdom. And here's what I mean by that. It's knowledge to know that a tomato is a fruit. It's wisdom not to put it in a fruit salad. That's my favorite. Sorry. It's questions and answers. Questions and answers. Questions and answers are good things. One of the things that I think people resist when it comes to organized religion is the certainty with which people speak of things that you cannot know for certain. There are questions and answers, I believe, in science and in faith. And that's what we get when we embrace both of them together, and also heart and mind. Heart and mind. Look at what Jesus said. He was having this discussion, this debate with these religious leaders. And this was normal. This was all the time, like religious leaders and rabbis and the different the Jewish law keepers. They would discuss these things. And Jesus was answering pretty good. It says one of the teachers of religious law was standing there listening to the debate. He realized that Jesus had answered well. This guy's on track. And so he asked, of all the commandments, which is most important? And this was actually a pretty common question when this would come up. What is your group and your interpretation of things? What is the most important commandment? Jesus replied, the most important commandment is this: listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is one and only, is the one and only Lord. And this is right out of the Jewish law. He pulls it straight out of there. He quotes it. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. I think for a lot of us, all of our mind meant this: I'm going to learn as much theology, I'm going to memorize as many Bible verses as I can, and we've turned our mind off to the rest of the thinking world. Many times people view religion as that's for unthinking people. Now, some of you are here today and you're like, no, I'm a spiritual person. I'm a person of faith. I think. Good. Keep doing that. Use that as a way to love God with our minds. We don't want to forsake our minds. See, a church with future influence embraces science as a means of discovery. One of the things that I think is so important about a life of faith is you are constantly discovering new ways to be human and to live in this world. and new ways of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. You're always being awakened and enlightened to those new things. And I think science and faith can do that for us. It moves us forward. We don't have to stay entrenched and dug into things. We can look at new evidence, new information, and we can grow and we can discover new ways to follow Jesus. Rob Bell, in his book, What We Talk About When We Talk About God, he has a whole chapter on this. He says, I say all of this about science and faith because when I'm talking about God, I'm talking about the source of all truth, whatever labels it wears, whoever says it, and wherever it's found, from a lab to a cathedral to a pub to Mars. We're discovering new things. And we can look at that evidence. And what I love to do is I love to, the thing that is most interesting to me, the science that's most interesting to me is physics, right? Like, especially like astrophysics. When the things that make me feel like the most small and insignificant, I am fascinated with. And when I look at it and I think of this ever-expanding universe, I think to myself, what a big, huge, broad, unbelievably infinite, so far out of my box and my way of thinking God that is also not just this huge cosmological thing, but this very personal thing as well, through the person of Jesus, that I can know and I can discover more about with science and faith.